A royal flush. Unbeatable. Chloe Davenport's heart soared with a single triumphant beat. She had won. She glanced over her shoulder at Leo, the silent guard who had been her anchor all night, waiting for one final confirming signal, but he coldly shook his head. No, ignoring him, ignoring the impossible betrayal in his eyes, she pushed all her chips to the center of the table. All in. The man across the table erupted in laughter as he turned over his cards. 4 of a kind. She had lost. Her father's entire legacy, her entire future turned to ash in a single, silent moment. What really happened in that fateful room? Let's find out. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you never miss what happens next. The city of Las Vegas glittered below a sprawling galaxy of captured stars and broken promises. From the penthouse suite of the Olympus Casino, in a private poker room they called the Eye of Providence, the view was supposed to signify power, control. From this height, you could believe you were a god gazing down upon a world of mortals. To Chloe Davenport, however, it felt like she was looking through the bars of a beautiful gilded cage. And tonight that cage was shrinking, the walls of glass and light closing in around her. The air in the room was a calculated blend, thick with the scent of a single malt whiskey she knew cost more than a car, the rich perfume of old leather, and the metallic tang of fear, mostly her own. Across the vast expanse of the green baize table, Julian Croft smirked. His teeth were a little too white, his bespoke suit a little too shiny, his eyes holding the flat, predatory gleam of a shark that had scented blood in the water. Her blood. This wasn't a game. She had to keep reminding herself of that. A game had rules of fair play, a sense of sportsmanship. This was an execution live-streamed for an audience of one her own crumbling resolve. The stakes were deceptively simple, laid out in a contract of cold, hard legalese that her lawyers had warned her against signing. Control of Davenport Innovations, her father's company, his life's work, the legacy he had built with his own 2 hands, with a brilliant mind and a heart that believed technology could change the world for the better. All of it now resting on the fickle turn of 52 cards. Julian had engineered this moment with the brutal precision of a master hunter, using a series of aggressive acquisitions and market manipulations to force her into this last desperate gamble. A private game, he'd called it in the press release, a gentleman's wager. There was nothing gentle about Julian Croft. Nervous Chloe, he purred his voice a low thrum of condescension that slid under her skin like a splinter of ice. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass. You should be. Your father was a brilliant man, a true visionary. I'll give him that. But he was a builder, not a fighter. He never would have let it come to this. A hot spike of anger, sharp and blessedly clean, shot through the thick fog of her anxiety. It was a relief, a focal point in the storm. My father built an empire on integrity, she replied, her voice dangerously soft, a tone she had perfected in boardrooms filled with men who underestimated her. A concept I'm sure you'd have to look up in a dictionary. His smirk widened a testament to his impenetrable ego. He enjoyed this, she realized, with a sickening lurch. He fed on it. The fear, the pressure, the slow, methodical dismantling of a legacy. This was his vintage, his drug of choice. Her phone vibrated on the small polished table beside her, a lifeline she was counting on more than she cared to admit. It was meant to be James, her head of security for the last decade, a man whose quiet presence had been a fixture in her life since her father's passing. He wasn't just a bodyguard. He was a bluff catcher, a human lie detector, a man who could read a card player's soul from the twitch of a thumb. In this room of smoke and mirrors, James was supposed to be her only piece of solid ground. she answered, turning away for a semblance of privacy she knew she didn't have. Julian was watching her every move. "James, where are you? The game's starting." The voice on the other end was weak, strained, punctuated by a miserable groan that made her stomach clench. "Chloe, I'm so sorry. I think it was the oysters at lunch. Food poisoning. A bad case. The hotel doctor just left. I can't even stand up." The blood drained from her face, leaving a cold, hollow feeling in its place. Oysters. Julian had sent over a platter of Ceylon oysters to her suite earlier as a good luck gesture. It wasn't a gesture. It was a move on the chessboard played hours before the game had even begun. He had found a way to take her last weapon away, to leave her completely isolated. Panic, cold and sharp, coiled in her stomach like a serpent. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. "I understand," she said, her voice a mask of impossible calm, a performance worthy of the grand stages on the strip below. "Get well, James." She hung up her mind a chaotic whirlwind of collapsing strategies. Forfeit never. That would be handing Julian her father's legacy on a silver platter, a trophy for his boundless avarice. She locked eyes with the casino manager, a man named Henderson, who had known her father for 30 years. She didn't need to say a word. Her expression a carefully constructed facade of a powerful CEO, now cracking under the weight of sheer desperation, said it all. He understood immediately his own face, grim with a shared, helpless anger. He leaned in his voice, a low, urgent whisper that smelled faintly of coffee and regret. "I can't get you a professional player, Chloe, not on this short notice and not for this game. Julian's already made sure of that. His people have blocked anyone I might call. But I have a man on security. Best eyes in the house. Never misses a thing. He's quiet. People forget he's even in the room. His name is Leo, a security guard. The idea was ludicrous, a straw to grasp at in a hurricane. A man who watched monitors for a living was meant to face off against a corporate psychopath like Julian. But a straw was better than drowning. She was out of options, out of time. She needed another set of eyes. Any eyes. "Get him!" she said, her voice tight, each word a clipped hard diamond of resolve. Now. A few minutes later, the heavy, soundproofed door to the suite opened, and Leo stepped inside. He was nothing like what she'd expected. He wasn't a mountain of muscle or a grizzled ex-cop with weary eyes. He was of average height, with a lean, athletic build that was hidden under a simple, well-fitted black security uniform. His hair was a nondescript brown, his face impassive, his blue eyes calm and unnervingly observant. He was utterly, completely unremarkable. He blended into the background so perfectly, he was almost invisible, a ghost in a black uniform. He was the kind of man you'd pass in a hallway a dozen times and never remember seeing once. She met him halfway across the room, the scent of his simple, clean laundry soap, a stark, grounding contrast to Julian's expensive, cloying cologne. She spoke in a low, urgent tone, a general briefing her troops for a suicide mission. "Your name is Leo. For the rest of the night, you are my security advisor. Your job is to stand behind me and watch him," she commanded, nodding towards Julian, who was now examining his perfect manicure with detached interest. "You watch his hands, his eyes, the way he breathes when he bets. You don't speak, you don't move, you just watch. If you see anything, a twitch, a tap, anything out of the ordinary that suggests he's bluffing, you have one signal. A single soft cough. Is that understood?" He looked from her to Julian, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second, a silent, cool assessment that seemed to take in everything. Then his eyes returned to hers. For a moment, she saw something flicker in their blue depths, Not pity, but a profound understanding that seemed entirely out of place for a simple casino guard. He gave a single sharp nod. "Good," she said, turning back to the table, feeling a sliver of control return, however illusory it might be. "Henderson will compensate you for your time." Handsomely. She sat down, her back ramrod straight, a queen reclaiming her throne, however precarious it might be. The dealer, a stone-faced man who looked as old as the desert itself, began to shuffle the deck. The soft rhythmic whisper of the cards was the only sound a countdown to her own demise. The door to the penthouse suite clicked shut, sealing the five of them, her Julian, Leo the dealer, and Henderson inside. The cage was locked. The execution was about to begin. The first hour was a brutal exercise in psychological attrition. The chips were mountains of ivory and clay, sliding back and forth across the table, representing acres of intellectual property server farms and the livelihoods of 500 employees. Each bet Chloe made felt like she was signing away a piece of her father's soul. She played conservatively, fighting her own instincts to take bold risks, instead relying on cold, hard probability. She was a CEO, a strategist, not a gambler. She managed risk for a living, and this was the antithesis of everything she had ever built. Julian, meanwhile, was in his element. He played with a theatrical predatory flair, raising with a dismissive flick of his wrist, his chatter a constant corrosive acid aimed at her composure. "You're playing scared, Chloe. That's your father's money, isn't it? Every chip. You can feel his ghost watching you disappointed, afraid to lose what you didn't build." She ignored him, her focus a laser beam on the cards on his face, on the subtle shift of his weight in the expensive leather chair. Behind her, Leo was a statue carved from shadow and silence. His stillness was unnerving at first, a void at her back. But slowly, impossibly, it began to feel less like a void and more like a shield. He was an anchor of calm in her personal storm. His silence, a counterpoint to Julian's endless noise. Then it happened. It was the seventh hand of the night. Julian had a strong board showing 2 kings visible among the community cards. He leaned forward, that confident, predatory gleam dancing in his eyes, and pushed a tower of black $100,000 chips into the pot. "Raise," he said, his voice smooth as silk, a sound she was beginning to truly hate. Chloe's own hand was decent, but perilously risky. A straight draw. She needed one of 2 specific cards on the final draw, the river, to complete it. The odds were against her. Her mind, a finely tuned calculator of probabilities, screamed at her to fold, to cut her losses, and wait for a better opportunity. But just as she was about to surrender her cards to the muck, she saw it, or rather she felt it. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift in the air behind her left shoulder, followed by Leo, casually, slowly tugging at his earlobe. It was a small, everyday gesture. Her eyes narrowed. Is that the signal, or does he just have an itch? The thought was so absurd, so mundane in this high-stakes arena, that a bubble of hysterical internal laughter rose in her chest. Dear God, I'm about to bet my entire company on a man who might just have an itchy ear. She looked at Julian's smug, expectant face. He wanted her to fold. He was projecting an ocean of confidence. But Leo's signal, if it was a signal, suggested Julian was all bluster. It was a bluff. Taking a breath that felt like she was inhaling shards of glass, she met Julian's gaze. She pushed her own stack of chips forward, matching his bet. "I'll see your raise," she said, her voice, a low, steady hum she didn't recognize as her own. The smirk on Julian's face faltered for a nanosecond, a micro-expression of surprise, so fleeting that if she hadn't been looking for it, she would have missed it completely. He hadn't expected that. He had expected her to crumble. After a moment of feigned consideration, he checked. The dealer laid down the river card. It was the Queen of Hearts, the exact card she needed. She had her straight. Julian's face was a mask of disbelief as she revealed her hand. He slammed his cards down in frustration. He had been bluffing with nothing more than the pair of kings on the board. Chloe raked in the massive pot, her hand shaking almost imperceptibly as it brushed against the cool chips. She didn't look back at Leo, but she could feel his presence, a silent affirmation. He had been right. Their strange, silent alliance had won its first battle. They played on a new rhythm settling between them. Leo's signals were a masterpiece of subtlety. A slight shift of his weight to his right foot for a bluff. A hand moving to smooth his simple black tie for a strong, hidden hand. A faint, almost invisible tightening of his jaw when he suspected Julian was setting a trap. Chloe learned to read him, to trust the silent, invisible language that flowed between them. They were a team, a bizarre and desperate duo, fighting a dragon in his lair. They won a pot. They lost a smaller one. They held steady, bleeding fewer chips than she would have on her own weathering Julian's assaults. During a brief pause to change the deck, Chloe finally allowed herself a moment to truly breathe. The pressure was still immense, the mountain she had to climb still impossibly high, but it was no longer a solo burden. She felt a flicker of genuine curiosity about the silent man behind her, this ghost who had become her shield. She turned slightly in her chair, keeping her voice low so only he could hear. "You have any questions?" she asked, a real inquiry this time, not a command. It was an offering, an acknowledgement of their shared space in this foxhole. Leo was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dealer's gnarled hands as they expertly shuffled the new deck. The silence stretched, and she thought he wasn't going to answer, that he would retreat back into his professional shell. Then, with a completely straight, impassive face, he spoke, his voice quiet and even, cutting through the tension with its sheer, unexpected mundanity. "Yes," he said. "Is there a coffee machine anywhere nearby? This looks like it's going to be a long night." Chloe blinked, momentarily thrown. The sheer absurdity of the question of its timing was like a splash of cold water. Of all the things he could have asked about the stakes, about Julian, about the signals he asked about coffee. A small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time that night. It was an absurdly human question in an inhuman situation. It made him real, and for some reason, that made her feel infinitely safer. "I'll have Henderson arrange it," she murmured, turning back to the table as the dealer prepared to deal the next hand. The alliance was solidifying. It was no longer just a desperate arrangement. It was a partnership. And Julian Croft, for all his power and wealth, had no idea what he was truly up against. He thought he was playing against one tired, scared woman. He was wrong. He was playing against two. The game paused for a contractually obligated 15-minute break, a brief ceasefire in a war of nerves. Julian stood stretched with the theatrical arrogance of a king surveying his domain, and strode out of the room to take a call, his two lawyers trailing him like pilot fish. Henderson and the dealer, with a shared, discreet nod, also exited, affording them a privacy that felt both necessary and profoundly unsettling. It left Chloe and Leo alone in the suspended silence of the penthouse. The glittering city outside seemed to hold its breath along with them. Chloe rose from the table, her muscles stiff with tension. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, her arms wrapped around herself, as if to hold the pieces of her composure together. The adrenaline that had been fueling her for the past 2 hours began to recede, leaving a profound, bone-deep weariness in its wake. She could feel Leo's presence behind her, not moving, not speaking, just existing. It was a comfortable silence now, not an awkward one, forged in the crucible of shared pressure. "You're good at this," she said, her voice soft, her reflection a ghostly silhouette against the Vegas lights. "Reading people. It's my job," he replied simply, his voice a low timbre from across the room. She turned to face him. He was leaning against the far wall, perfectly relaxed, a stark contrast to her own frayed state. In his right hand, he was rolling a single poker chip between his thumb and forefinger. It wasn't one of the pristine, high-value chips from their table, with their sharp edges and bold colors. This one was old, its clay surface worn smooth with time, and touch its once vibrant colors faded to a pale echo of what they must have been. It looked like something a child might have kept in his pocket for years, a treasured, worthless thing. She had noticed him touching it intermittently throughout the night, a small, unconscious grounding gesture. "Is that a good luck charm?" she asked, a real note of curiosity in her voice. It was the first personal question she had asked a small crack in her professional armor. He glanced down at the chip, and for the first time, his impassive mask didn't just crack, it fell away completely. A shadow passed through his eyes, a flicker of an old, deep pain that was so raw and unexpected, it made Chloe's breath catch in her throat. He didn't answer her question directly. Instead, he just looked at the chip, and for him, the room, the city, and Chloe herself seemed to fade away. The world dissolved into the memory of another casino 30 years ago. Not a sanitized penthouse suite like this one, but a smoky, bourbon-soaked hall in Atlantic City, filled with desperate men with hungry eyes. He was 8 years old, perched on a worn-out bar stool, nursing a flat soda, watching his father. His father, Big Jack Thorne, was a legend in the making, a man who had clawed his way up from the dirt with nothing but a brilliant mind for numbers and nerves of pure steel. He was playing for a construction contract that would be the foundation of their family's future. That night, his father was a god, infallible and magnificent, his laughter booming as he raked in the final pot. He was building something. He was a creator. And the boy, watching with wide-eyed adoration, wanted to be just like him. The memory shifted, the edges blurring and reforming into a colder, sharper image. He was 18 now, home from his first year at college. His father was no longer Big Jack the builder. He was Marcus Thorne Sr., the tycoon. The games were no longer in smoky halls. They were in sterile boardrooms and exclusive private clubs like this one. The stakes weren't construction contracts. They were companies' futures' lives. The joyful thrill of the win was gone, replaced by a cold, insatiable hunger for the kill. The game had consumed him. That night his father had been playing against a small family-owned tech firm from Ohio. He didn't just win, he annihilated them. He leveraged their debt, forced a hostile takeover, and bankrupted the owner, a good man with a kind face who had put his entire life into his company. He remembered his father laughing about it afterward, a sound devoid of all its former warmth. He should have known better than to sit at a table with a shark, he'd said. Later, the boy had confronted his father in his vast, silent office. He asked him when the game stopped being about building and started being about breaking things. His father had looked at him with eyes that were as cold and hard as polished stone. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out that same old worn poker chip, the first one he'd ever won, the one he'd shown his son with such pride all those years ago. He tossed it across the mahogany desk. It skittered to a stop in front of the boy. "This is the only thing that's real, kid," his father had said, his voice flat. "This chip, the win. Everything else is just talk. You either play the game or the game plays you. Don't ever be sentimental." That was the last real conversation he ever had with his father. A few years later, consumed by his own insatiable game, Marcus Thorne Sr. had been played outmaneuvered in a deal of catastrophic proportions. He lost everything. And rather than face a world where he was no longer a player, he ended his own life in that same empty office. Marcus blinked the glittering lights of the present, rushing back in sharp and painful. Chloe was still watching him, her head tilted slightly, her intelligent eyes searching his face, sensing the shift in him. He closed his hand around the chip, its worn surface, a familiar grounding comfort against his palm. He had spent his life and his inheritance building a different kind of empire, one dedicated to dismantling the corrupt, soul-crushing games men like his father and Julian Croft played. He went into the dark places, the high-stakes rooms and compromised boardrooms, not as a player, but as a guardian, a regulator of a lawless world. He was constantly testing himself, always testing, to see if he could master the game without letting it master him, to see if he could hold on to his own soul in a world that tried to buy it at every turn. He finally looked up and met Chloe's questioning gaze. It's a reminder. He said, his voice quiet but firm, the echo of his past, hidden just beneath the surface. A reminder of what happens when you forget what you're really playing for. Before Chloe could ask what he meant, what could possibly be more important than what was on the table tonight, the door to the suite opened. Julian strode back in his swagger, fully restored, a fresh wave of predatory confidence rolling off him. Henderson and the dealer followed, their faces grim. The break was over. As Marcus moved back to his position behind Chloe's chair, his resolve was like tempered steel. This wasn't just a job anymore. It wasn't just about saving a company. It was personal. He was here to end Julian's game permanently, for Chloe, for her father's legacy, and for the ghost of the man who had given him that chip. A steady hand can lose the pot, but save the table. The air in the room, which had briefly thinned during the 15-minute break, now condensed again, thicker and more suffocating than before. The pretense of civility, thin as it was, had been stripped away completely. This was the endgame, the bloody final act. Julian returned to the table a different man. The smug, playful confidence he'd worn earlier had been replaced by a cold, focused brutality. He had clearly been briefed by his lawyers during the break, his strategy refined into a single-minded weapon aimed directly at Chloe's heart. He didn't sit down immediately. Instead, he addressed Henderson, his voice carrying an imperious tone that commanded the attention of the entire room. "Let's raise the stakes, shall we?" Julian announced, his gaze flicking to Chloe only at the end of his sentence. "Table stakes are for tourists and amateurs. From this moment forward, the full value of our respective assets is in play. My controlling shares in Croft Consolidated versus her controlling shares in Davenport Innovations. Winner take all. No more nickel and dime bets that just prolong the inevitable." Chloe's blood ran cold. This was it. He was removing the safety net, taking away her ability to strategically fold and survive. Every hand from now on was for the entire company. She looked at Henderson, searching for an objection, a rule that could protect her. He simply gave a grim, almost imperceptible nod. The terms of the game agreed upon beforehand allowed for this escalation. It was legal. It was binding. The game resumed, but the rhythm was gone, replaced by a jagged, violent tempo of aggression. Julian's attacks were no longer just on her playing style. They were on her identity, her legacy, her father. "Your father. You know he approached me for a partnership once," Julian said casually as he discarded a card, his voice laced with false sincerity. "Years ago. A desperate move, really. I turned him down, of course. He was too sentimental. He talked about innovation for the good of humanity. Can you imagine such naivete? He simply didn't have the stomach for what it really takes to win in this world. My father had a vision." Chloe shot back, her voice tight with a fury she refused to let him see. Something you wouldn't recognize if it was printed on the back of a dollar bill. You don't build, you only devour. Semantics. Julian waved a dismissive hand, the massive gold ring on his pinky finger catching the light. Empires are built on the bones of failed visionaries. He'd be so disappointed, don't you think, to see his little girl, the one he tried to shield from all this, gambling away his life's work in a single night. Each word was a calculated blow, a poison dart designed to make her emotional, to cloud her judgment, to make her reckless. She could feel Leo's stillness behind her, a silent, unwavering presence. It was the only thing keeping her grounded, a lighthouse in a hurricane of insults. She focused on the game, on the cards, on Leo's almost imperceptible signals. They won a small pot. They lost one. The mountains of chips, now representing everything she held dear, shifted back and forth, a tide of fortune she was struggling to control against a relentless storm. The pressure was becoming a physical force, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The lights of the city outside seemed to mock her, a world of vibrant life and movement, while her own universe had shrunk to this single suffocating room. Her mind, usually her sharpest asset, felt sluggish, fighting through a fog of anger and fear. She was being tested to her absolute limit, pushed closer and closer to a breaking point she wasn't sure she could survive. The dealer, his face as impassive as ever, as if he were merely dealing cards for a penny ante game in some dusty back room, collected the cards for a new hand. He seemed to be moving in slow motion, every action amplified in the tense silence. Chloe watched his hands, gnarled and ancient, as they shuffled the deck with a practiced, fluid motion. Those hands had seen fortunes won and dynasties fall. Tonight, they held her future. Julian leaned back in his chair, the picture of relaxed confidence, a predator toying with its cornered prey. "You know, Chloe, it doesn't have to be this way," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial softness that was more threatening than his shouting. "There's still time to fold. Concede. Be my chief operating officer. You'd have a comfortable life, a very generous allowance, no more of this stress." The offer was the most profound insult he could have possibly delivered. It wasn't a lifeline, it was a leash. He didn't want a partner, he wanted a pet. He wanted to own her father's name, to parade her around as the ultimate trophy of his victory. Chloe straightened her spine, a fire igniting in her eyes that burned away the fog of fear and fatigue. She was the daughter of John Davenport. She was the CEO of Davenport Innovations. She would not be broken. She would not be bought. "Deal the cards," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound steely authority that surprised even herself. It was the voice of a fighter. It was her father's voice. The dealer nodded, his ancient eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second, and in them she thought she saw a flicker of something that might have been respect. He placed a card face down in front of her, then one in front of Julian. He continued his circuit, the soft slap of the cards on the felt, the only sound in the room, a drumbeat marking the path to her salvation or her ruin. Then he spoke, his voice, a dry rasp that cut through the tension like a razor, each word landing with the weight of a gavel. The final hand, the words hung in the air, electric and final. This was the point of no return. Everything her father's dream, her own future, the fate of her company, it all came down to this single last hand. The winning hand is not always the one you can see. Time itself seemed to warp, stretching and compressing in the suffocating silence of the room. The dealer's movements, once fluid, now seemed deliberate, each card laid down with the gravity of a final judgment. Chloe's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner in the cage of her own body, but for the first time, it was a rhythm of fierce, unadulterated hope. She peeked at her 2 whole cards, cupping them protectively. The ace of spades, the king of spades, a monster hand, a hand of power of royalty. A surge of pure, triumphant electricity shot through her, so potent it almost made her dizzy. This was it. After hours of grinding, of absorbing insults and fighting off despair, the cards had finally come to her. This was the hand her father would have wanted, for her a weapon to slay the dragon. The dealer burned a card and laid down the flop. 3 cards face up in the center of the table. The 10 of spades, the 4 of hearts, the jack of spades. Chloe's breath hitched. She had a flush draw with 2 overcards. The possibilities were immense. Julian, for his part, made a standard bet, his face an unreadable mask of cool indifference. He was setting a trap, she knew, trying to build the pot. She called her own hand steady now, the tremor gone, replaced by a cold, thrilling certainty. The dealer burned another card. He laid down the turn card. The Queen of Spades. The world narrowed to that single beautiful card. She had it. The nut flush. The unbeatable hand. A royal flush. It was the rarest, most powerful combination in poker. A hand so legendary, it was almost mythical. A wave of triumphant, righteous certainty washed over her, clearing the last vestiges of fear from her mind. It was over. She had won. It was more than a winning hand. It was a sign from the universe, a blessing from whatever ghosts watched over games like these. Vindication. Now she just had to play it right. Let him bet. Let him think he was in control. Let him walk into the beautiful, perfect trap she held in her hands. Julian, as if on cue, leaned forward. He didn't push a stack of chips this time. He slid his entire formidable mountain into the center of the table with a soft, definitive whoosh. All in, he said, his voice dripping with finality. He was trying to scare her off. He was representing a full house, or 4 of a kind, trying to make her fold a lesser hand. The irony was so thick she could taste it. He had no idea he was betting into the absolute, unbeatable nuts. This was the moment, the culmination of the entire night. She would call his bet, he would show his hand, and she would lay down hers, ending this nightmare once and for all. But first, as she had done all night, as their silent contract dictated, she allowed her gaze to drift for a fraction of a second, seeking the silent confirmation from her stoic guardian. She expected a nod, a slight tightening of his tie, the signal for overwhelming, undeniable strength. What she saw sent a tremor of ice-cold shock through her entire system, derailing her victory lap before it had even begun. Leo was looking directly at her, his blue eyes clear and impossibly intense. And in a motion so small, so subtle that anyone else in the room would have missed it, he gave a single sharp, almost violent shake of his head. No, the signal was unmistakable. It was the sign for danger, for a trap. The sign she had come to trust, implicitly. It was the signal to fold. The world tilted on its axis, logic and reality warring within her. Fold, a royal flush. It was impossible. It was insane. Her mind reeled, trying to process the violent contradiction, the perfect, unbeatable evidence of her own eyes versus the silent, insane signal from the man she had inexplicably come to trust. What does he see that I don't? What could possibly beat this? But the rational thought was drowned out by a tidal wave of emotion. Julian's sneering face, his taunts about her father, the crushing weight of her responsibility, and a new terrifying thought wormed its way into her mind. What if Leo was wrong? What if, at this final critical juncture, his nerve had finally broken? He was just a security guard after all. What did he truly know of stakes like these, of a hand this monumental? Maybe he was scared. Maybe he was trying to get her to play it safe, to cut her losses, not understanding that there was no safer bet in the universe than the one she held. The trust she had so carefully built with him over the last few hours, fractured, then shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. In that moment of ultimate pressure, she felt a profound, crushing sense of isolation. She was alone again. It was her legacy on the line, her call to make. She would not be a coward. She would not fold a winning hand on the word of a man who had clearly lost his mind or his courage. She would trust herself. She would honor her father. She locked her eyes on Julian's. "I call." The words felt strange in her mouth. They weren't the triumphant declaration she had imagined. They were heavy, freighted with a defiant, tragic finality. For the first time all night, Julian's mask of cool indifference broke. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He laughed, a loud, genuine, unrestrained laugh of pure, unadulterated victory that echoed in the silent, horrified room. "Oh, Chloe," he said, wiping a tear of mirth from the corner of his eye. "You really are your father's daughter. So much heart. So very little killer instinct." He slowly, dramatically turned over his cards. "A pair of 10s. Chloe frowned in confusion. "A pair." He went all in with a pair of 10s. Her royal flush would crush that. She started to turn over her own cards, a triumphant smile beginning to form on her lips. "Not so fast," Julian said, his smile turning sharp and cruel. He nodded at the dealer, and then Chloe saw it. The dealer's left hand, which had been resting innocuously at the edge of the table, moved with a speed that was barely a blur. In an impossible act of sleight of hand, he switched the turn card on the table, the beautiful Queen of Spades, with a card that had been hidden in his palm. The new card was the 10 of diamonds. The board now read 10 of spades, 4 of hearts. Jack of spades, 10 of diamonds. The river card came down, the 10 of clubs, 4 10s. Julian's hand, holding the final 10 from the deck, now made an unbeatable 4 of a kind. The air rushed out of her lungs in a silent scream. The royal flush was gone, an illusion, a magic trick designed to lure her to her doom. The room began to spin, the glittering lights of Vegas blurring into streaks of mocking laughter. She had lost. She hadn't just lost a game. She had been cheated, dismantled, and destroyed. She had lost everything. Some losses are too heavy to make a sound. The world swam back into focus, in surreal slow-motion horror. The dealer, his face still an impassive granite slab, impassively confirmed the hands, his dry voice a death sentence. Julian leaned back in his chair, basking in the glow of his conquest, a Roman emperor surveying the ruins of Carthage. He didn't even look at his chips anymore. He looked at Chloe, his eyes devouring her defeat. Henderson, his face ashen with a shame that was not his own, mumbled a quiet, "Chloe, I'm so sorry," that she barely heard. A lawyer in a suit as sharp and bloodless as his smile placed a preliminary document on the table in front of her. It was an acknowledgement of transfer, a single piece of paper that signed her father's ghost away. Her hand moving, as if it belonged to someone else, a marionette on a string, picked up the heavy gold-plated pen. The scratch of the nib on the thick, expensive paper was the loudest sound she had ever heard the sound of her world ending. She stood up, her legs unsteady, but her spine ramrod straight. Dignity was the only thing she had left. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She didn't look at Julian. She couldn't. Her gaze, however, fell on Leo, who was standing by the door, his expression as unreadable as it had been when he first walked in. He had watched her lose everything. He had told her to fold. The thought was a fresh stab of pain, a new venomous question twisting in her gut. Had he known, had he seen the cheat, And if so, why hadn't he done anything? Why just the silent, useless signal that had only served to make her feel insane? Her rage cold and sharp and clean, cut through the fog of her shock. It was a temporary shield against the crushing grief that was waiting just beneath. She walked out of the room without a word, her head held high, a queen abdicating her throne. Leo followed his footsteps, a quiet, maddening echo of her own. The elevator ride down was a descent into a silent, suffocating hell. The mirrored walls, polished to a perfect sheen, reflected a woman she didn't recognize her face, a pale, brittle mask, her eyes hollowed out craters of despair. She could feel his presence beside her, his stillness a screaming accusation. When the doors opened into the private carpeted corridor, leading to her suite, she finally turned on him. The corridor was empty, a silent witness. Why, she whispered, her voice, a raw, broken thing stripped of all its former power. Why did you just stand there? Leo's blue eyes met hers. They held no apology, no sympathy, just that same, unnerving, unreadable calm. His silence was his answer. It was the answer of a coward, or worse, a conspirator. Had he been bought, was that it? Was his quiet presence just another part of Julian's elaborate, cruel game? You were my only hope. She continued the words, tumbling out, laced with a bitterness that choked her. I trusted you. In that insane, God-forsaken room, I actually trusted you. I put my father's entire legacy in your hands, and you just stood there and watched him burn it to the ground. You are a coward, Leo. A gutless, empty coward. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He just watched her, his silence a wall. She couldn't break a wall that confirmed every terrible thing she was thinking. It was the ultimate betrayal. He had offered a glimmer of hope, a silent alliance, only to abandon her at the finish line. With a choked sob that was more rage than grief, she turned and fled to her suite, jamming the keycard into the slot with a shaking hand. She slammed the door behind her, the heavy thud echoing the final, brutal closing of a chapter of her life. The suite was a cavern of luxury, a monument to a life that was no longer hers. The champagne on ice, the bowl of exotic fruit, the plush sofas, it all seemed to be mocking her now. She walked through it like a ghost in her own mausoleum. The silence pressed in on her heavier than any sound. She saw her reflection in a large, ornate mirror, and for a moment she saw her father's disappointed eyes staring back, asking her how she could have let this happen. The dam broke. A wave of grief and rage, so powerful it buckled her knees, crashed over her. She snatched a crystal glass from the bar, its weight heavy and cold in her hand, and hurled it against the far wall. The sound of it shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces was a brief, satisfying release, a sound that finally matched the chaos inside her. But it wasn't enough. The emptiness remained vast and echoing. She sank onto the plush carpet, the sobs racking her body raw and ugly and unstoppable. She cried for her father, for the dream he had poured his life into. She cried for his company, for the employees, whose futures she had just gambled away on a single foolish hand. And she cried for her own naivete, for her stupidity in trusting a stranger, a quiet man with calm eyes, who had done nothing while her world burned. She had been warned about the sharks in these waters her whole life. Her father had tried to shield her from them, but she had never imagined she would be so completely, so utterly devoured. The lights of Vegas, which had seemed like a cage just hours ago, now seemed like a distant, indifferent heaven from which she had been cast out. Each one was a tiny, mocking eye in the vast, empty darkness. She had hit rock bottom, a place of absolute failure and profound, crushing loneliness. In the quiet emptiness of the room, there was nothing left but the bitter echoes of her own defeat. Ruin is sometimes just the shadow of a rescue. The sun rose over the desert, a merciless, indifferent eye in the sky, casting long, mournful shadows across the Las Vegas Strip. For Chloe, it was the dawn of a new, desolate reality. She hadn't slept. She had eventually moved from the floor to an armchair, sitting huddled under a cashmere throw, the shattered remains of the crystal glass, a glittering, crystalline wound on the far side of the room. The silence of the suite was a physical presence, broken only by the incessant muted buzzing of her phone. Lawyers, board members, her mother. A chorus of panic and confusion she couldn't bring herself to face. Each buzz was another grain of salt, rubbed into the raw, gaping wound of her failure. She was numbly scrolling through her tablet, a morbid curiosity forcing her to read the first of the gloating financial headlines: Croft executes flawless hostile takeover of Davenport Innovations in high-stakes game, when a news alert flashed across the top of her screen, bold and intrusive. She almost dismissed it, but the headline caught her eye. She tapped it, and a live news broadcast filled the screen. The image was chaotic. A swarm of reporters, flashing cameras, and dark-suited men moving with grim purpose through the opulent lobby of the Olympus Casino. And in the center of it all was Julian. His face, usually a mask of smug control, was a contortion of furious disbelief. He was in handcuffs, being led by two stone-faced FBI agents. The headline beneath the image was stark, impossible: Julian Croft, arrested in federal sting. Chloe stared, her mind struggling to connect the words to the man she had lost to just hours before. The reporter's voice was a torrent of information, each word a hammer blow to her understanding of reality. Sources say Croft was the target of a months-long investigation into a massive international money laundering ring with ties to the Juarez cartel. Last night's high-stakes poker game, where Croft reportedly won control of Davenport Innovations, is now believed to have been the final piece of a complex sting operation designed to catch him in the act of laundering several $100 million. The tablet slipped from her numb fingers, clattering onto the thick rug. A sting operation, money laundering. The room began to spin the facts of the last 12 hours, dissolving into a confusing, vertiginous haze. A sharp, authoritative knock sounded at her door. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to curl back into her ball of misery and let the world handle its own madness. But the knock came again, firm and insistent, a sound that would not be denied. She pulled herself to her feet, her body aching with a weariness that went bone deep and numbly padded to the door. She looked through the peephole, expecting a hotel manager or another lawyer. Her heart stopped. It was Leo. But it wasn't Leo. The simple, ill-fitting security guard uniform was gone. In its place was a bespoke, charcoal-grey suit that fit him perfectly, exuding an aura of quiet, formidable power. His hair, once nondescript, was now styled with a casual, expensive precision. His face was the same, yet entirely different. The impassive mask was gone, replaced by an expression of sharp intelligence and a hint of weary regret. He wasn't alone. He was flanked by two people, a man and a woman in crisp business attire who looked like high-powered lawyers. She fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking, and opened the door. "Chloe," he said. His voice was the same calm tone, but now it carried the undeniable weight of authority. "I think we need to talk again." He stepped into the room, his team waiting respectfully in the hall. He handed her a different tablet, one he had been carrying. On the screen was not a news article, but a detailed intelligence dossier, complete with surveillance photos and financial charts. It outlined the entire criminal enterprise, with Julian Croft at its center. It detailed the sting operation, the marked cards, the dealer who was actually a decorated federal agent, every intricate piece of the trap. Chloe's eyes flew across the text, her heart pounding, a frantic, confused rhythm against her ribs. I don't understand, she stammered, looking up from the screen into his calm blue eyes. Who are you? He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a slim leather wallet. He flipped it open to a business card. The engraving was simple, elegant, and it hit her with the force of a physical blow. Marcus Thorne, Chairman, Thorne Global Strategies. Thorne Global, the legendary, almost mythical firm specializing in corporate security, hostile takeover defense, and crisis management. They were the ghosts CEOs called when their empires were on fire. They were brilliant, ruthless, and impossibly expensive. Julian's winning hand was a fiction. Marcus explained, his voice even and precise. The deck was rigged, yes, but not for him to win cleanly. It was designed to create an unimpeachable money trail, a public spectacle of him winning a legitimate asset with illicit funds. My signal to you, Chloe, telling you to fold, wasn't about saving you from losing the hand. It was about saving your company from being legally complicit in his crime. If you had folded, the evidence would have been weaker, more circumstantial. By going all in, you forced his hand completely. You made his use of the cartel's funds so blatant, so public, that there was no escape. It was the final nail in his coffin. He paused, his blue eyes locking with hers, and in them she finally saw the apology he hadn't been able to give her in the elevator. I am sorry for what I had to put you through. It was a calculated risk. I had to let you believe you had lost. It was the only way to ensure Julian couldn't find a legal loophole to escape through. Your reaction, your genuine devastation, had to be real for the entire trap to work. The entire nightmarish landscape of the last 12 hours rearranged itself in her mind with dizzying speed. The betrayal, the loss, the humiliation. It had all been a performance, a necessary sacrifice in a much larger war she didn't even know she was fighting. He hadn't been a coward. He had been a general sacrificing a pawn to checkmate the king. And she had been the pawn. The weight of the revelation was so immense, it was almost comical. The absurdity of it all. She looked at him, the man she had called a gutless coward, the man who had just saved her father's legacy in the most brutal, brilliant way imaginable. A slow, shaky breath escaped her lips. A single absurd thought cut through the chaos in her mind, and a dry, half-hysterical smile touched her lips. So, she said, her voice barely a whisper, does this mean I still have to pay you for last night's security services? For the first time since she had met him, Marcus Thorne's lips curved into a genuine, tired smile. It transformed his entire face, chasing the last of the shadows from his eyes. Consider it a professional courtesy, he said. A small investment in the future of Davenport Innovations. Vulnerability is the highest stake you can ever wager. The whirlwind of federal agents, casino executives, and lawyers eventually subsided a storm that had raged through the penthouse suite and then vanished, leaving a strange, quiet vacuum in its wake. The news was official. The results of the game were nullified. Julian Croft's assets were frozen, pending a massive federal investigation, and Davenport Innovations was safe. Completely, utterly safe. Chloe and Marcus stood by the same floor-to-ceiling window from the night before. The sun was higher now, its harsh, unfiltered light glinting off the distant sleeping towers of the Strip. The city looked different in the daylight. More real. Less like a cage made of neon and more like a collection of concrete dreams, some realized, some broken. I owe you an apology, Chloe said softly, her voice steady now. She wasn't looking at him, but at their dual reflections in the glass, two solitary figures against a backdrop of endless blue sky. I called you a coward. You had every right to, Marcus replied, his voice losing its corporate edge, becoming something warmer, more personal. I put you through hell. There was no other way to guarantee the outcome. But that doesn't make it right. He paused. You weren't the only one who felt the stakes. She finally turned to face him, her eyes clear and searching. What you did. It was more than just a job, wasn't it? He looked down at his hand, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the old, worn poker chip. He held it out on his open palm for her to see. It seemed impossibly small and insignificant in the bright morning light. My father. He began, his voice, quiet, stripped of all its earlier authority, and left with only the raw texture of memory. He built an empire with a mind like a steel trap and nerves to match. He started with nothing but a few $100, and this chip which he won in a backroom game in Atlantic City. He loved the game. The strategy, the risk, the feeling of outthinking every other man at the table. He rolled the chip over with his thumb. But somewhere along the way, he started to love the game more than the prize. He loved the winning more than what he won. The game became a hunger that could never be filled. In the end, it was all he had left. This chip. It reminds me that the most important thing at the table is knowing what the real stakes are. Last night, for me, the stake wasn't Davenport Innovations. It was making sure a man like Julian Croft, a man who reminded me so much of who my father became, couldn't play anymore. He was giving her a piece of himself, a key to the man behind the brilliant strategist. It was an act of vulnerability, so profound, so unexpected, that it cracked open something inside her. It deserved one in return. My father, he hated this world. She confessed, her own voice a near whisper. The games, the backstabbing, the corporate predators. He just wanted to build things to create technology that actually helped people. When he died, I felt this crushing weight. This need to be him, to be as strong and visionary as he was, but also to be the fighter he refused to be. I was so terrified of failing him, of letting one of the sharks get what he built, that I almost walked right into the oldest trap in the book. She looked at Marcus, at the man she had hired as a guard, accused as a traitor, and now understood as a savior. You didn't just save my company, Marcus. You saved me from becoming someone my father wouldn't have recognized. They stood there in the quiet morning light, the professional masks completely gone no longer. CEO and guard, no longer strategist and client. They were just two people who had seen each other at their absolute worst, at their most vulnerable, who had navigated a minefield of lies and emerged on the other side. The air between them was charged with a new kind of tension, not of fear or conflict, but of dawning mutual respect and a startlingly deep connection. A genuine smile, the first she had felt in weeks, a smile that reached all the way to her eyes, touched Chloe's lips. Just for the record, she said, a playful, teasing glint in her eye. Your next proposal had better be significantly less stressful. He laughed, a real unguarded sound that transformed his face, chasing the last of the shadows from his eyes. It was the sound of relief, of a shared victory that had nothing to do with money. I can promise that, he said, his smile matching hers. But I can't promise the stakes will be any lower. The old game, the one played with cards and lies and cold hard cash, was over. But a new one, she sensed, was just beginning. A different kind of game with different rules, and as he said, much, much higher stakes. The stakes weren't companies or contracts anymore. They were trust connection and the terrifying, thrilling possibility of something real. Chloe turned back to the window, looking out at the endless desert sky. The view was the same, but her perspective had changed entirely. She was no longer looking through the bars of a cage. She was standing at the edge of an open world, a world of possibilities she was finally ready to explore. She felt Marcus come to stand beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. They stood in a comfortable silence, two equals watching the start of a new day. And for the first time in a very long time, Chloe Davenport felt completely and utterly free. In the great game of life, isn't it a profound thought that the deepest betrayals can sometimes be the most profound acts of faith? What we perceive as our moment of ruin can in the quiet light of dawn reveal itself as our rescue. Chloe's journey reminds us that true strength isn't found in an unbreakable defense, but in the courage to trust after we believe we have been broken. It's in the quiet understanding that grows from the ashes of what we thought we had lost, and the realization that the winning hand isn't always the one we can see. What did this story awaken in you? We would be honored to read your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. If Chloe and Marcus's story of a trust forged in fire resonated with you, a simple like is always deeply appreciated. And if you know someone who might find strength in this message, please consider sharing it with them. To continue exploring these intricate human dramas with us, we invite you to subscribe and join our community. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Until the next story, be well.